The gunshot that echoed through the dusty streets of Brownsville, Texas, that scorching August morning in 1882, wasn't meant for Franklin Jenkins, but it came close enough to make him dive behind a water trough and reconsider his entire approach to hiring ranch hands. He'd been looking for workers at the cattle auction when two drifters decided to settle their differences right there in broad daylight. And as Franklin pressed his back against the splintered wood, watching his hat roll away in the Texas wind, he thought about how desperately he needed help that wouldn't shoot him or disappear after a week of honest labor. His ranch, the Double J, spread 20 miles north of town, had been hemorrhaging money since his father died 6 months ago. The old man had run things with an iron fist and the loyalty of men who respected hard work. But those men had scattered after the funeral, taking jobs with bigger outfits or heading west to try their luck in California. Franklin, at 26 years old, found himself alone with 3,000 acres, 200 head of cattle, and a mortgage that the bank reminded him about with increasing frequency. He needed someone who understood what it meant to work from sunup to sundown, someone who wouldn't complain about blistered hands or aching muscles, someone who could see past the immediate discomfort to the potential of what the Double J could become. The shooting stopped as quickly as it started. One man lay dead in the street. The other was being hauled away by the sheriff, and Franklin retrieved his hat with a sigh that came from somewhere deep in his chest. He was a tall man, lean from too much work and not enough food, with dark hair that constantly fell into his eyes, and a jawline his mother used to say was too stubborn for his own good. His clothes were clean but worn, patched in places where fabric had given way to the demands of ranch work, and his boots had seen better days, though he kept them polished out of habit. He was heading back to where he'd tied his horse when he saw her for the first time. She stood beside a wagon loaded with trunks and boxes, her posture rigid as she argued with a man who appeared to be refusing her passage. Even from a distance, Franklin could see the frustration in the set of her shoulders, the way her hands clenched at her sides. She wore a simple dark blue traveling dress, practical rather than fashionable, and her auburn hair was pulled back in a severe bun that somehow made her face look both young and determined. As Franklin watched, she reached into her reticule and pulled out what looked like the last of her money, pressing it into the man's palm with visible desperation. The man counted it, shook his head, and walked away. Franklin saw her shoulders slump for just a moment before she straightened again, looking around the busy street as if trying to figure out her next move. Something about the way she refused to give up, even when clearly exhausted and out of options, made him change direction and walk toward her. "Excuse me, miss," he said, removing his hat as he approached. "I couldn't help but notice you're having some difficulty. Can I be of assistance?" She turned to face him, and he found himself looking into eyes the color of honey in sunlight, sharp with intelligence and wariness. Up close, he could see the dust of travel on her dress, the slight sunburn on her nose, the way her lips were chapped from too much wind. She was maybe 23 or 24, pretty in an unconventional way that had more to do with the strength in her face than any classical features. "Unless you're heading north and willing to take a passenger, I doubt it," she said, her voice carrying the crisp accent of someone educated back east. "But I appreciate the offer." "How far north?" Franklin asked. "Anywhere between here and San Antonio would do," she replied. "I'm supposed to meet my cousin there, but my funds have run shorter than anticipated, and it seems the stage line isn't inclined toward charity." Franklin considered for a moment. San Antonio was 150 miles northeast, which meant she'd have to pass right by his ranch. He looked at the wagon full of belongings, at the determined set of her jaw, and made a decision that was probably foolish but felt necessary. I've got a ranch about 20 miles from here, he said slowly. The Double J, I'm heading back there now, and while it's not San Antonio, it's north. You could stay there for a spell, work off your room and board, save up enough money to continue your journey. Her eyes narrowed. Work? What kind of work? Ranch work, Franklin said honestly. Cooking, mending, tending the kitchen garden if you know how. I've been managing alone since my housekeeper left, and I'll be frank with you, miss. I'm drowning. The place needs a woman's touch, or at least someone who can cook something besides burnt beans and jerky. She studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing the risks of accepting help from a stranger against her limited options. I'm Hannah Sutherland, she said finally, from Boston, and I'll have you know I'm perfectly capable of hard work, Mr. Jenkins, Franklin Jenkins. He extended his hand, and after a brief hesitation, she shook it. Her grip was firm, her palm already bearing calluses that suggested she wasn't lying about the hard work. If you're worried about propriety, I should mention that old Miguel Cortez and his wife Rosa live in the foreman's cottage on the property. They've been there since before I was born. Rosa can chaperone, and Miguel's as good as any father when it comes to protecting young ladies' reputations. Hannah's shoulders relaxed slightly. How much could I earn in a month? Enough for stage fare and then some, if you're as capable as you claim, Franklin said. Plus room and board, which means you'd be saving rather than spending. She looked at her wagon, then back at the stage office, then at Franklin. He could see her making calculations, running through her options. Finally, she nodded. All right, Mr. Jenkins. But I'll want our arrangement in writing, and I'll need your word as a gentleman that you'll respect the boundaries of an employer and employee. You have it, Franklin said, meaning it. Let me help you load your things onto my wagon. It took them the better part of an hour to transfer her belongings. Franklin was surprised by the number of books she had, heavy volumes on agriculture, animal husbandry, and land management that seemed odd choices for a young woman from Boston. When he commented on it, Hannah's expression became guarded. I like to be prepared, she said simply. Knowledge is never wasted. They left Brownsville as the afternoon heat was reaching its peak, and Franklin found himself grateful for the broad-brimmed hat that shaded his face. Hannah had produced a similar hat from one of her trunks, practical rather than decorative, and she sat beside him on the wagon seat with her back straight, and her eyes scanning the landscape with undisguised curiosity. It's different from what I expected, she said after they'd been traveling for an hour. The books make it sound more romantic. Franklin laughed, a short bark of sound that surprised them both. The books lie, he said. This land will kill you if you're not careful. The heat, the drought, the floods when the rains finally come, the rattlesnakes, the cattle thieves. There's nothing romantic about losing half your herd to disease or watching your crops wither because the river's running dry. Then why stay? Hannah asked. Franklin was quiet for a moment, guiding the horses around a particularly deep rut in the road. Because it's mine, he said finally. My father built the Double J from nothing, and before he died, he made me promise to keep it going. Besides, for all its hardships, there's something about this place. The sky's bigger here. The stars are brighter. When things go right, when the cattle are fat and the grass is green and you can sit on your porch and see land stretching out in all directions knowing it's yours, there's no better feeling in the world. Hannah nodded slowly, as if filing away his words for future consideration. What happened to your previous housekeeper, Mrs. Patterson? She decided married life in town suited her better than ranch work, Franklin said. Can't say I blame her. Her husband got a job at the general store, and she didn't want to be out here alone all day while I was working the cattle. Most women don't. Most women aren't given the choice, Hannah said quietly. Franklin glanced at her. "You sound like you speak from experience." She was quiet for so long he thought she wouldn't answer. Then, in a voice barely audible over the creak of the wagon wheels, she said, "My father died 2 years ago. He left everything to my brother, including the house I grew up in. My brother's wife didn't appreciate having another woman under her roof, so I was given two choices: marry the man they'd selected for me or make my own way. I chose the latter." "The cousin in San Antonio?" Franklin asked. "A fiction," Hannah admitted. "I needed a destination that sounded respectable. In truth, I have no idea where I'm going or what I'll do when I get there. I only knew I couldn't stay in Boston and marry a man who saw me as property to be managed." Franklin felt a surge of respect for this woman who'd chosen uncertainty over security. "For what it's worth, Miss Sutherland, I think you made the right choice." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her entire face. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins. That means more than you know." They reached the Double J as the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that made the landscape look almost otherworldly. Franklin's ranch house was a long, low adobe structure with a covered porch and shutters that needed painting. The barn was in better shape, as were the corrals where a few horses stood with their heads hanging in the evening heat. Beyond that, Franklin could see the small cottage where Miguel and Rosa lived, smoke rising from the chimney suggesting Rosa was cooking dinner. Hannah climbed down from the wagon before Franklin could help her, her eyes taking in everything with an assessing gaze that reminded him of the way his father used to evaluate livestock. He couldn't tell if she was impressed or disappointed and found himself caring more about her opinion than he should. "It's larger than I expected," she said finally. "The house, I mean. How many rooms?" "6, Franklin said, starting to unload her trunks. 3 bedrooms, kitchen, dining room, and what my mother used to call the sitting room, though nobody's sat in it much since she passed. You can have the bedroom at the end of the hall. It gets the morning sun, and there's a window that catches the breeze when there is one." They were interrupted by the approach of an older Mexican man, his weathered face breaking into a smile when he saw Franklin. "Patron, we did not expect you back until tomorrow." "The auction was a waste of time, Miguel," Franklin said, clasping the older man's hand. "But I've brought help. This is Miss Hannah Sutherland. She'll be working as housekeeper for a time. Miss Sutherland, this is Miguel Cortez, my foreman and the man who taught me everything I know about cattle." Miguel's dark eyes assessed Hannah with the same thoroughness she'd applied to the ranch. Whatever he saw must have satisfied him because he nodded respectfully. "Welcome to the Double J, Señorita. My wife Rosa will be happy to have another woman here. She complains that she is outnumbered by men and horses." Hannah laughed, and Franklin was struck by how natural it sounded, how different from the forced laughter of the town girls who giggled behind their fans and batted their eyelashes. "I'll be happy to meet her, Mr. Cortez. Just Miguel, please," the older man said. "Come, I will help with these trunks and Rosa will feed you. She made enchiladas tonight and there is always too much food." Over dinner in the small, warm kitchen of Miguel and Rosa's cottage, Franklin watched Hannah relax for what seemed like the first time since he'd met her. Rosa, a plump woman with kind eyes and hands that never stopped moving, fussed over Hannah like a mother hen, insisting she eat more, rest, tell them about her journey. Miguel asked intelligent questions about Boston, about her family, about her plans, and Franklin could see Hannah weighing each answer carefully, revealing just enough to be polite without exposing her vulnerabilities. When Rosa learned that Hannah had been managing her father's household after her mother's death, she nodded approvingly. "Then you know real work," she said. Not like these town girls who think cooking means telling a servant what to prepare. You will do well here, I think." After dinner, Franklin walked Hannah back to the main house, carrying a lantern to light their way. The night was alive with sounds, crickets and frogs, the distant yip of coyotes, the rustle of wind through dry grass. Hannah walked beside him without fear, her head tilted back to look at the stars. "You were right," she said softly, "about the stars being brighter here." "Tomorrow will be easier," Franklin said when they reached the house. "I'll show you around, explain what needs doing. We'll start slow." Hannah turned to face him, her expression serious in the lantern light. "Mr. Jenkins, I meant what I said about being capable of hard work. I don't need to start slow. Just tell me what needs doing and I'll do it." Franklin found himself smiling. "Then tomorrow we'll start fast, Miss Sutherland. Get some rest. Breakfast is at dawn." He left her in the house and made his way to his own room, lying awake long into the night thinking about honey-colored eyes and a determination that matched his own. He told himself he'd hired her because he needed help, which was true. He told himself her staying was temporary, which was also true. He did not allow himself to think about how right it had felt to have her sitting beside him on the wagon, or how her presence seemed to fill some emptiness in the house he hadn't known existed until now. Hannah was up before dawn, and Franklin found her in the kitchen attempting to light the old wood stove with mixed results. He showed her the trick to it, the way the flue had to be adjusted just so, and together they managed to coax it into cooperation. She made coffee that was actually drinkable, fried eggs and salt pork, biscuits that were only slightly burnt on the bottom. "I'm out of practice," she admitted, looking at the biscuits with disappointment. "It's been 2 years since I had a proper kitchen." "They're better than anything I've made in 6 months, Franklin assured her. "Eat up. I want to show you the whole operation before it gets too hot to think." He took her around the ranch on horseback, lending her one of his gentler mares. Hannah sat the horse competently, another surprise in a growing list of them. She asked good questions about the cattle, about water sources, about the repairs needed on various fences and structures. She didn't complain about the heat or the dust, and when they stopped by a dried-up creek bed, she crouched down to examine the soil with the focus of someone who actually understood what she was looking at. "You said the river's running dry," she said, standing up and brushing off her split riding skirt. Franklin had been trying not to notice how the practical garment suited her. "Is there any way to irrigate from a deeper source?" "There's a spring about 2 miles east," Franklin said. "My father always talked about running pipes, but it would take money we don't have and labor I can't spare." Hannah nodded thoughtfully, but didn't press the issue. They rode back to the house as the noon heat was becoming unbearable, and Franklin left her to settle in while he went to work on mending tack in the barn. When he came in for supper that evening, the house smelled like bread and roasting meat, and the kitchen was cleaner than it had been in months. Hannah served him pot roast with potatoes and carrots, bread that was golden brown and perfect, coffee that was strong enough to stand on. She sat across from him at the scarred wooden table, eating her own portion with the focused attention of someone who'd worked hard and earned her meal. "Rosa helped," she admitted when he complimented the food. "She's teaching me to make tortillas tomorrow." "You don't have to learn everything at once," Franklin said. "Why not?" Hannah countered. "The more I learn, the more useful I become. Besides, I like Rosa. She reminds me of my mother." They fell into a routine over the next few weeks. Hannah would rise before dawn to start breakfast, and Franklin would join her in the kitchen, still rubbing sleep from his eyes. They'd eat together in comfortable silence, and then he'd head out to work the cattle while she tackled the endless list of household chores. But Hannah wasn't content to stay in the house. By the second week, she was helping Miguel mend fences. By the third, she was in the barn learning to treat minor injuries in the horses. By the fourth, she was riding out with Franklin to check the herds, her face shaded by that practical hat, her eyes constantly scanning for problems. "You didn't come west to be a housekeeper," Franklin said one afternoon as they watched cattle graze on what little grass remained. It wasn't a question. Hannah was quiet for a moment. "No," she admitted. "I came west because I wanted to build something of my own. In Boston, women can't own property unless they're widows. They can't run businesses. They can't make decisions about their own lives. I thought out here where everything's newer, there might be more possibilities." "There are," Franklin said, "but they're hard-won. This land doesn't care if you're male or female, it'll test you either way." "Good," Hannah said fiercely. "I'm tired of life being easy and empty. I'd rather it be hard and mean something." Franklin looked at her, really looked at her, and felt something shift in his chest. She was sunburnt and dusty. Her hands were developing calluses to match his own, and there was a smudge of dirt on her cheek she'd missed. She'd never looked more beautiful to him. He cleared his throat and looked away. "We should head back. There's a storm coming." The storm hit that night with the fury of something that had been building for weeks. Thunder shook the house, lightning turned night into day, and rain pounded the roof like drumbeats. Franklin lay in bed listening to it, grateful for the moisture but worried about flash floods, about the cattle spooked by thunder, about whether the barn roof would hold. He was considering getting up to check on things when he heard footsteps in the hall. Hannah appeared in his doorway, wrapped in a shawl, her hair loose around her shoulders. "I heard something in the barn," she said. It sounded like a horse in distress. Franklin was on his feet immediately, pulling on boots and grabbing his coat. They ran through the rain together, Hannah keeping pace with him despite the mud sucking at her shoes. In the barn, they found one of the mares in labor, distressed and struggling. Franklin swore under his breath. This mare was young, her first foal, and he'd been watching her carefully but hadn't expected her to deliver for another week at least. "What do we do?" Hannah asked, already rolling up her sleeves. "Stay with her," Franklin said. "Talk to her, keep her calm. I need to check if the foal's positioned right." For the next 2 hours, they worked together in the lamplight while the storm raged outside. Franklin guided the foal into the correct position while Hannah held the mare's head, speaking softly to her in a voice that was surprisingly steady given the circumstances. When the foal finally emerged, slick and shaking, Hannah laughed with pure joy. "It's a colt," Franklin said, checking quickly. "Strong lungs on him, too." They stayed in the barn until the colt was standing, until the mare had cleaned him and accepted him, until Franklin was satisfied that both mother and baby would be fine. By then, the storm had passed, leaving the air smelling clean and the ground finally, blessedly wet. Walking back to the house as dawn broke, both of them soaked and exhausted, Franklin felt Hannah slip her hand into his. It was such a natural gesture, so unstudied, that he found himself squeezing her fingers without thinking. "Thank you," he said. "I couldn't have done that without you." "Yes, you could have," Hannah said, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." They stood on the porch watching the sunrise paint the sky pink and gold. Franklin knew he should let go of her hand. He knew they were employer and employee, that she was saving money to leave, that he had no right to the feelings growing in his chest. But when Hannah leaned her head against his shoulder, just for a moment, he allowed himself to hope that maybe she felt something too. The weeks turned into months. Summer gave way to autumn and the landscape shifted from brown to gold. The rain from the storm had helped, but it wasn't enough. Franklin could see his cattle getting thinner, could see the stress of drought in every blade of struggling grass. He spent long nights going over the accounts, trying to figure out how to make the ranch profitable enough to satisfy the bank. Hannah found him one such night, slumped over the desk in his father's old office, surrounded by papers and ledgers. She didn't say anything, just set a cup of coffee at his elbow and began reading over his shoulder. "Your problem is water," she said after a long silence. "Everything else stems from that." "I know," Franklin said tiredly, "but I can't make it rain and I can't afford the irrigation system." "What if you didn't need pipes?" Hannah asked. She leaned over the desk, pushing aside papers to reveal a blank sheet, and began to sketch. "There's a technique I read about, used in ancient Persia. Qanat systems, they're called. You dig a series of shallow wells following the natural water table, connect them with underground tunnels. Gravity does the work of moving the water." Franklin studied her drawings. "That would still take labor I can't afford. What if you had volunteers?" Hannah persisted. "Some of the smaller ranchers around here must be having the same problems. If you could convince them that a shared water system would benefit everyone, they might be willing to contribute labor in exchange for access." It was brilliant, and Franklin told her so. Over the next few weeks, they rode out together to neighboring ranches, presenting Hannah's idea. Some refused outright, too suspicious or too set in their ways. But others listened, and slowly, Franklin assembled a coalition of 6 ranchers willing to pool resources and labor. They broke ground on the Qanat system in October. Franklin worked alongside his neighbors, digging and hauling dirt, while Hannah managed the logistics, making sure everyone had food and water, coordinating schedules, solving disputes. Miguel and Rosa watched this development with knowing looks, and Rosa began making pointed comments about how nice it would be to have a wedding at the ranch. Franklin tried not to let himself imagine it. Hannah had been with them for 4 months now. She'd saved enough money to reach San Antonio 3 times over, but she never mentioned leaving. He didn't ask, afraid that bringing it up would remind her that she'd planned this as temporary. One evening in late November, with winter approaching and the Qanat system finally showing results, thin streams of water flowing where before there'd been only dust, Franklin found Hannah on the porch watching the sunset. She'd become a fixture of this place, as much a part of the Double J as the land itself. Her face was tanned now, her hands work roughened, and when she smiled at him as he joined her, Franklin felt his heart constrict with emotion he could no longer deny. "We did it," Hannah said softly. "The water's flowing." "You did it," Franklin corrected. "I'd have given up months ago if not for you." Hannah shook her head. "You wouldn't have. You're not the giving up type, Franklin Jenkins." It was the first time she'd used his given name, and the sound of it on her lips undid something in him. "Hannah," he said, then stopped, not knowing how to continue. She turned to face him, her expression open and vulnerable in a way he'd never seen before. "Don't," she said quietly. "Don't say it if you don't mean it. I can handle hard work. I can handle drought and difficult cattle and endless chores. But I can't handle having hope dangled in front of me only to have it snatched away." "I mean it," Franklin said, taking her hands in his. "I've meant it since the day you helped birth that colt, maybe before. I love you, Hannah. I love your strength and your intelligence and the way you attack every problem like it's a challenge to be conquered. I love how you've made this house a home and this ranch something worth fighting for. I know you plan to move on, and I'll understand if that's still what you want, but I need you to know that if you stay, it won't be as an employee. It'll be as my partner, as my wife if you'll have me." Hannah's eyes were bright with tears. "You're sure?" "This isn't the life I was supposed to have, Franklin. I can't be the kind of wife who stays in the house and looks pretty. I'll want to work the ranch, to make decisions, to be an equal partner in everything." "That's exactly the kind of wife I need," Franklin said. someone who understands hard work, someone who arrived and proved she could handle anything, someone like you." She kissed him then, and it was like rain after drought, necessary and perfect and long overdue. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Franklin rested his forehead against hers. "Is that a yes?" he asked. "Yes," Hannah laughed. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll stay. Yes to all of it." They were married in December. A small ceremony in the ranch house with Miguel and Rosa as witnesses, and a few neighboring ranchers as guests. Hannah wore a simple white dress that Rosa had helped her sew, and Franklin wore his father's best suit, altered to fit his shoulders. When the traveling preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Franklin kissed his bride and heard Miguel's delighted whoop, Rosa's happy tears, the scattered applause of friends who'd become family. The winter was mild, which Franklin took as a good omen. The cannet system continued to function, providing enough water to keep the cattle healthy through the dry months. Hannah threw herself into learning everything about ranch management, riding out with Franklin every day, attending cattle auctions, even helping with the spring branding. In March, she told him she was pregnant. Franklin felt terror and joy in equal measure, remembering how his own mother had died bringing him into the world. But Hannah took his face in her hands and said, "I'm strong, Franklin. We'll get through this together." Rosa moved into the house 2 months before the baby was due, fussing over Hannah and driving them both slightly mad with her constant attention. Franklin found himself unable to sleep, starting awake at every sound, checking to make sure Hannah was breathing. She tolerated his worry with patience, though she threatened to make him sleep in the barn if he didn't stop hovering. Their son was born in September of 1883, on a crisp morning when the air smelled like autumn and promise. The labor was long and difficult, and Franklin paced the porch with Miguel, both men jumping at every sound from inside the house. When Rosa finally emerged with a squalling bundle and a tired smile, Franklin nearly collapsed with relief. "A healthy boy," Rosa announced. "And Hannah is fine, tired but asking for you." Franklin went to his wife, finding her pale and exhausted but smiling. She held their son against her chest, and when she looked up at Franklin, her eyes were full of love and triumph. "Meet Frederick," she said. "Frederick James Jenkins." Franklin touched his son's tiny hand, felt the impossibly small fingers curl around his thumb, and felt something in his heart expand until it was almost painful. "He's perfect," he whispered. "You're perfect." "I know," Hannah said with a weak laugh. "Now sit with us. I want to memorize this moment." As their son grew, the ranch prospered. The cannet system brought water to previously unusable grazing land, allowing Franklin to expand his herd. Other ranchers, seeing the success of the Double J, began implementing similar systems. Franklin and Hannah became respected figures in the area, sought out for advice on everything from water management to cattle breeding. Hannah never stopped working, though she balanced it with motherhood in a way that amazed Franklin. He'd watch her ride out to check fences with Frederick strapped to her back in a sling Rosa had made, or see her reviewing accounts while nursing the baby, and marvel at her seemingly endless capacity for managing multiple demands. When Frederick was 2, they had a daughter they named Helen Marie. She came into the world screaming and never really stopped, a whirlwind of energy and determination, who reminded Franklin forcefully of her mother. Hannah took the chaos in stride, managing 2 small children and a working ranch with the same competence she brought to everything. The years passed in a blur of hard work and happiness. Franklin would sometimes watch Hannah across the dinner table, surrounded by their children and the comfortable clutter of their life together, and feel overwhelmed by gratitude. She'd arrived in Brownsville with nothing but determination and a wagon full of books, and she'd transformed not just his ranch but his entire life. By 1890, the Double J was one of the most successful ranches in southern Texas. The mortgage was paid off, the herds were healthy and growing, and Franklin had even been able to buy the adjoining property when it came up for sale. Frederick, at 7, was already showing signs of becoming a natural horseman. Helen, at 5, had announced she wanted to be a cattle baron when she grew up, which made Hannah laugh with delight. Miguel and Rosa were getting older, moving more slowly, but they refused to fully retire. Miguel still consulted on major decisions, and Rosa still fussed over everyone, now including 2 grandchildren of her own who lived in town. The ranch employed 6 full-time hands and a dozen more seasonal workers, and there was talk of Franklin running for the state legislature. One evening in spring, after the children were finally asleep and the house was quiet, Franklin found Hannah on the porch swing they'd installed the year before. She was looking out at the land, at the dark shapes of cattle moving in the distance, at the stars that still seemed brighter here than anywhere else. He sat beside her, and she leaned into him automatically, fitting against his side as if she'd been designed for that purpose. They'd been married 8 years, and Franklin loved her more now than he had on their wedding day. He loved the gray hairs starting to show at her temples, the laugh lines around her eyes, the capable strength in her hands when she held his. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. "About that day in Brownsville," Hannah said. "When you offered me a ride north, I thought I was so desperate accepting help from a stranger. I thought I was settling because I had no other choice." Franklin felt a flicker of hurt, quickly smoothed over. "And now?" Hannah turned to look at him, her honey-colored eyes bright in the starlight. "Now I know I was finding my way home," she said. "I wasn't settling. I was arriving exactly where I was meant to be." "I love you," Franklin said, the words as necessary as breathing. "I love you too," Hannah replied. Every hard one, dusty, perfect day of it. They sat together in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch settling for the night. Inside the house, their children dreamed whatever children dream. In the foreman's cottage, Miguel and Rosa were likely already asleep. In the barn, horses dozed in their stalls. And across the fields, water flowed through the Cannet system, bringing life to land that had once been barren. Franklin thought about the gunshot that had driven him behind a water trough, about seeing Hannah arguing with the stage line operator, about the impulsive decision to offer her a ride north. Such a small moment, such an insignificant choice, and yet it had led to everything he now treasured. "Come to bed," Hannah said, standing and pulling him to his feet. "Tomorrow's another long day." "Tomorrow's always a long day," Franklin agreed, following her inside. But as they walked through their home, past the children's rooms where Frederick and Helen slept peacefully, past the kitchen where breakfast dishes were already set out for morning, into their own bedroom where moonlight streamed through the window, Franklin found himself grateful for every long day, every challenge, every moment of this life they'd built together. He needed someone who understood hard work. Hannah had arrived and proved she could handle anything, and in the process, she'd become not just his partner in the ranch, but his partner in everything. She was his wife, his friend, his co-conspirator in building something lasting from dust and determination. As he held her that night, listening to her breathing slow into sleep, Franklin made a silent promise to his younger self, to the desperate man behind the water trough who'd thought he was alone. "You're not alone anymore," he thought. "You found her. You found everything you needed, and more than you knew to hope for." The years continued to unfold with the rhythm of ranch life, seasons turning in their eternal cycle. Frederick grew tall and serious, taking on more responsibility with each passing year. By the time he was 15, He was managing portions of the ranch himself, displaying his mother's intelligence and his father's steady nature in equal measure. Helen, true to her childhood declaration, showed no interest in traditional feminine pursuits, preferring to ride alongside her father and learn everything about running a successful cattle operation. In 1895, Hannah discovered she was pregnant again, a surprise given that she was now 36, and they'd assumed their family was complete. Franklin worried, remembering the difficulties of her previous births, but Hannah approached this pregnancy with the same pragmatic determination she brought to everything else. "Women have been doing this forever," she told him when he fretted. "I'm healthy, I'm strong, and I have Rosa." Stop hovering. Their second daughter arrived in November, small but perfectly healthy, and they named her Margaret Rose, after Franklin's mother and Rosa, who'd been such a constant presence in their lives. Frederick and Helen were enchanted with their baby sister, and Franklin often found himself watching his older children hold the baby with a gentleness that made his throat tight with emotion. The turn of the century brought changes to Texas. The frontier was closing, towns were growing, railroads were connecting previously isolated communities. The wild lawlessness that had characterized the region when Franklin was young was giving way to civilization, though the land itself remained as challenging as ever. Miguel passed away peacefully in his sleep in 1902, and they buried him on a hill overlooking the ranch he'd helped build. Rosa followed him 2 years later, and Franklin and Hannah grieved as if they'd lost their own parents. The foreman's cottage stood empty for a while before they finally hired a new foreman, a young man from San Antonio who was eager to learn and reminded Franklin forcefully of himself 20 years earlier. Frederick married in 1905, bringing home a practical young woman named Sarah who Hannah immediately adored. They built a house on the northern portion of the ranch, and Frederick took over management of that section while still coordinating with his father on larger decisions. When their first child was born the following year, making Franklin and Hannah grandparents at 43 and 47 respectively, Hannah cried happy tears and declared that life just kept getting better. Helen, to everyone's surprise except Hannah's, fell in love with a schoolteacher from town, a gentle man who appreciated her fierce independence and had no desire to tame it. They married in 1907 in a ceremony held at the ranch, with half of southern Texas in attendance. Helen and her husband settled in Brownsville, where she opened a business selling cattle to Eastern buyers, using her knowledge and connections to become one of the most successful dealers in the region. Margaret, their youngest, was the dreamer of the family, always with her nose in a book, always asking questions about the wider world. She reminded Franklin of Hannah when they'd first met, full of curiosity and determination to learn everything. By the time she was 10, she'd announced her intention to become a veterinarian, and Hannah had immediately begun researching schools back east that might accept female students. Franklin turned 50 in 1906, marking the occasion with a party that drew friends and neighbors from across the region. He stood on his porch that evening, looking at the crowd gathered to celebrate, at the ranch that stretched out in all directions, at Hannah moving through the guests with easy grace, and felt a satisfaction so deep it was almost painful. They'd built something lasting. Not just a successful ranch, though the Double J was certainly that. They'd built a family, a community, a life that had meaning beyond mere survival. Every fence line, every well, every building on the property represented hours of hard work, yes, but also represented hope and partnership and love. That night, after the guests had left and the children had finally gone home to their own families, Franklin and Hannah sat on their porch swing as they'd done countless times over the years. Hannah's hair was mostly gray now, and Franklin's joints ached in the mornings, but when she looked at him, he still saw the determined young woman who'd argued with a stage line operator in Brownsville all those years ago. "You remember what I told you that first day?" Franklin asked. "About the sky being bigger here, the stars being brighter." "I remember," Hannah said. "I was wrong," Franklin said. "It's not the sky or the stars. It's having someone to share them with that makes them beautiful." Hannah smiled, the expression creating familiar creases in her face that Franklin loved. "You've gotten poetic in your old age, Franklin Jenkins." "I've gotten honest," he corrected. "I spent so many years just surviving, just working to keep this place going. I didn't understand what I was missing until you arrived and showed me there could be more. That hard work could be shared, that success meant nothing if you achieved it alone." "We've had a good life," Hannah said softly. "Better than I ever imagined back in Boston when I thought I'd have to choose between marriage and meaning." "The best life," Franklin agreed. "And it's not over yet. We've got years ahead of us, and grandchildren to spoil and Margaret to see through school." Hannah laughed. "Always planning, always thinking ahead. Some things never change." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the sounds of the ranch at night, sounds that had become as familiar as their own heartbeats over the decades. In the distance, cattle lowed softly. Closer by, horses moved in the corral. A coyote called from the hills and was answered by another, their voices rising in a wild harmony that never failed to raise goosebumps on Franklin's arms. "I'm glad I ran out of money in Brownsville," Hannah said suddenly. "I'm glad that stage operator refused me. I'm glad you happened to be there that day." "It wasn't luck," Franklin said. "It was meant to be. I needed you, even though I didn't know it yet. And you needed this place, this life, even though you were planning something entirely different." Hannah turned to kiss him, and it was sweet and familiar, tasting of the coffee they'd shared after dinner and the life they'd built together. When she pulled back, she was smiling. "Come to bed, husband. Tomorrow's another long day." "Tomorrow's always a long day." Franklin repeated the words that had become their ritual, following her inside one more time. The years that followed were gentle ones, the kind of peaceful prosperity that comes after decades of hard work and wise decisions. Franklin gradually turned over more of the daily operations to Frederick, though he remained active in planning and decision-making. Hannah continued to ride out to check on things, though less frequently, and spent more time working on the business side of the ranch, managing accounts and contracts with her characteristic efficiency. They celebrated their 30th wedding anniversary in 1913 with another party, this one including 4 grandchildren with a 5th on the way. Frederick's family was thriving, Helen's business was expanding into new markets, and Margaret had just been accepted to veterinary school in Pennsylvania, one of only 3 women in her class. Standing before their friends and family, Franklin raised his glass in a toast. 30 years ago," he said, "I was a desperate man looking for help I couldn't afford, and into my life walked a woman who was equally desperate but far too stubborn to admit it. We made a bargain, she and I, room and board in exchange for hard work. But somewhere along the way, that bargain became a partnership, and that partnership became love, and that love became this life we've built together." He turned to look at Hannah, his voice thick with emotion. "You arrived and proved you could handle anything, Hannah. And you've been proving it every day since. You've made me a better man, a better rancher, a better father. You've made this land bloom where it was barren, and you've made my heart full where it was empty. I love you more today than I did when we married, which I wouldn't have thought possible if someone had told me back then." Hannah's eyes were bright with tears. "You needed someone who understood hard work," she said, her voice carrying across the quiet gathering. "And I needed someone who would let me work hard for something that mattered. We found each other at exactly the right moment, in exactly the right place. And I would do it all again, every difficult day, every challenge, every moment of uncertainty, because it all led to this. To us. To everything we've built together." They kissed while their family and friends cheered, and Franklin felt the same surge of love and gratitude he'd felt on their wedding day, only deeper now, richer, tempered by decades of shared experience. The party lasted late into the night, with music and dancing and stories told and retold. Frederick spoke about learning to ride, and how his mother had been just as likely to teach him as his father. Helen told about the time her parents had let her accompany them on a cattle drive when she was 10, despite the scandalized objections of some of the ranch hands. Margaret shared her excitement about school, about finally pursuing the dream her parents had always encouraged. As the stars wheeled overhead and the celebration continued, Franklin found himself thinking about time, about how quickly it passed, and how each moment was precious. He thought about the gunshot that had sent him diving behind a water trough, about the decision to approach a stranded young woman at a stage stop, about every choice, large and small, that had led to this moment. The ranch would continue after he was gone, passed down through Frederick to his children and their children after that. The Cannet system still flowed, bringing water to the land. The house he and Hannah had shared, had raised their children in, had lived their life in, would stand for generations as a testament to what could be built with hard work and partnership and love. But more than physical legacy, Franklin knew they were leaving behind something intangible but equally important. They'd shown their children that marriage could be a true partnership, that hard work had value beyond money, that determination and love could overcome almost any obstacle. They'd proven that a woman could be just as capable as any man when given the chance, and that a man was stronger with an equal partner than with a subordinate. As the party finally wound down and guests began heading home, Franklin and Hannah stood together on their porch one more time, watching the last wagons disappear into the darkness. The house behind them was a mess that would need cleaning in the morning, but neither of them cared. 30 years, Hannah said wonderingly. Sometimes it feels like yesterday, and sometimes it feels like forever. Both, Franklin said. It's been both. They went inside together, through the house that was so full of memories it seemed like the walls themselves must remember. Past the kitchen where they'd shared thousands of meals and conversations. Past the sitting room where their children had played, and their grandchildren now tumbled. Into their bedroom where the moonlight still streamed through the window, just as it had on their wedding night. Franklin held his wife, feeling her heartbeat against his chest, steady and strong. She'd arrived in his life when he needed her most, proving she could handle anything he or the land could throw at her. And in the process, she'd shown him what it meant to truly live rather than merely survive. "I love you," he whispered into her hair. "I love you too," Hannah replied. "Every day, every moment, every challenge we've faced together." They fell asleep wrapped in each other's arms, two people who'd found each other against impossible odds and built something beautiful from dust and determination. Outside, the land stretched out under stars that did indeed seem brighter here, eternal and unchanging. Inside, two hearts beat in rhythm, a harmony perfected over 3 decades of shared life. The Wild West was changing, becoming something tamer and more civilized. But in this house, on this ranch, in this marriage, the spirit that had made the frontier what it was still lived. The willingness to work hard, to face challenges head-on, to build something lasting from nothing. The courage to take chances on strangers, to offer help when it was needed, to accept help when pride might demand otherwise. Franklin and Hannah had needed each other in ways neither had fully understood at first. He'd needed someone who understood hard work, and she'd arrived and proved she could handle anything. But more than that, they'd needed each other's hearts, minds, and souls. They'd needed partnership and love and companionship through all the long days and longer nights that made up a life. And they'd found it, in a dusty Texas town in 1882, when a gunshot sent a desperate rancher diving for cover, and a stranded young woman refused to give up hope. They'd found everything they needed in each other, and in finding it, they'd created something that would last long after they were gone. As dawn broke over the Double J Ranch, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, Franklin and Hannah slept peacefully, their hands still intertwined. Around them, the ranch began to wake. Cattle stirred in the fields, horses nickered in the barn, and the water flowed through channels dug by determination and desperation, bringing life to land that had once seemed impossible to tame. It was a new day on the frontier, as it had been every day for over 30 years. And somewhere in the foundation of everything good that had been built here, in every fence post and water channel and strong beam, was the love of two people who'd found each other when they needed it most, and had never let go. The story of Franklin and Hannah Jenkins became the kind of legend that gets passed down through generations. Not because anything particularly dramatic happened, but because something rare and wonderful did. Two people found each other, worked hard together, loved deeply, and built a life that mattered. In the Wild West, where so many stories ended in tragedy or dissolution, theirs ended in triumph and partnership and love that lasted. And if you visit southern Texas today, you can still find the Double J Ranch, still run by Jenkins' descendants, still using portions of the canat system that Hannah designed all those years ago. The original house still stands, preserved and maintained, a testament to everything that can be built when two people arrive at exactly the right moment, ready to prove they can handle anything life throws at them, together.